Welcome everyone to the first Arlington Advocates for Restorative Justice Town Hall meeting. My name is Lauren Epstein and I'll be your host tonight. Thanks for joining us. We're excited to have you and your friends hear our renowned experts in the study of restorative justice. Thalia González is from Occidental College and Dr. Carl Stauffer is from Eastern Mennonite University. Let me tell you a little bit about them. Professor Thalia is a nationally recognized expert in the field of restorative justice, with more than 2 decades of experience in law, policy, and practice. Her primary research field focuses on theories and practice of restorative justice. Carl teaches restorative and transitional justice at the Graduate Center for Justice and Peacebuilding at Eastern Mennonite University. He currently serves as the co-director of the Zaire Institute of Restorative Justice and is the academic director of the Co-Scholars Program in Switzerland. Are you curious about restorative justice? Are you interested in learning about practices, some of which are already being implemented or explored in Arlington? These that address wrongdoing by focusing on healing and fairness for victims and offenders instead of retribution is what we'll be talking about tonight. Our experts will do a deep dive on restorative justice and answer your questions. This is an interactive session. Just so you know, every few minutes we're going to take a pause and take questions from the audience. Our guests are going to discuss the efficacy of restorative justice in its various applications and imagine, in conjunction with you, the audience, how Arlington can benefit from its increased adoption in our criminal justice, our schools, and our community. Several months ago, I spoke to Leanne Roselle, and Leanne Roselle lives here in Arlington. She is currently working for the Arlington County government and has been detailed from the Annie E. Casey Foundation. She's been putting together a restorative justice playbook. And when I spoke to her, I was really excited about the whole process. And I wanted to help her out. And I noticed that a lot of myself and a lot of my friends really didn't know what restorative justice is. At the end of the year, she's going to present her final plan, and there's going to be an opportunity for the county board to decide whether this is funded or not. And I hope through tonight's talk and our future talks, we have several planned, that you will learn more and become more educated so you can be informed. Also know that we are video recording this event, which will be posted to YouTube. If you don't want to be videoed, then don't talk, but just to, just let you know this is going to be videotaped. Again, every few minutes we'll pause so that you can answer questions. Now I'd like to introduce our guests, Carl and Thalia. Welcome.
Thank you, Lauren. It's really great to be here, and I'm excited to be able to share the panel with Thalia, a good colleague.
Oh, Thalia, excuse me.
Friend, yeah. And so it's just a delight to be here, and I want to just echo that I really hope this can be a conversation for the many folk who are here who have the questions about what this thing called restorative justice might look or feel like in Arlington. We need to hear your voices, and so I'm hoping we'll have some good time to converse on that. I'm going to start off just a little bit here to talk a bit about what is RJ. For some of you, this might be the first time you're coming into the concept. Others of you have considerable more experience. So we'll take a few moments just to get everyone hopefully on the same page to begin the conversation. And so I've been in this field since 1991. I started out as the executive director of a restorative justice program in the criminal justice system in Richmond, Virginia in 1991. I then also moved to South Africa in 1994 and was involved with restorative justice in that context. And I can talk about that if anyone's interested. I've been teaching at Eastern Mennonite University for the last 10 years, involved with restorative justice and peace building writ large. I think when I talk about restorative justice, the reason I'm still in this field, the reason I'm still here, the reason I'm willing to talk about this, Lauren, is I've seen the application of restorative justice in so many different ways. And so whether it was from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where we applied some of this between amnesty applicants and communities and surviving families, to whether it's homicide cases where there was gangs in the Johannesburg city of South Africa, or whether it was right here locally in Harrisonburg when we're working with our local police and they're dealing with shoplifting or any other number of harms. And you're going to hear both of us probably refer to crime as harm often, because we believe that that shifts a little bit beyond just the legal code to understanding how restorative justice can be applied much more broadly than the criminal justice system. However, let's start there at the criminal justice system, because that's where the first practices sort of emerged in the more contemporary history of restorative justice. So let me just say a few things here. I think it's important to understand a few things about restorative justice. It's not only a practice, it is a philosophy. There are principles, there are theories, there's research out there. And so there's a lot of questions about what it is and what it can accomplish. And I want to couch that in three ways. Some people say restorative justice is a good social service among many. And I agree, restorative justice should be a good social service. We should be able to have a very practical set of skill sets that would allow people to deal with crime and harm in a constructive way that would bring some resolution. And we as communities should own that process. But I believe it's much more than a social service. It's also a lifestyle. It's a different worldview. As Dr. Howard Zehr, who's one of the founding voices in the field, and who I taught, learned under and taught with, and the center that I'm part of is named after, talks about this as a paradigm shift. A paradigm shift meaning we have to change our worldview. And what is that change happening? At the base is a real skeptical question about whether people change through punishment, and whether they change faster and more effectively through harsher, harder, and longer punishment. And much of our current system is built on that basis. And so restorative justice, as the name restorative indicates, wants to take another view and open up the conversation to say, hey, maybe we as people act and are motivated and change our behaviors that harm in multiple ways. And punishment is no longer the center of the configuration of what we understand justice to look like in our society. And then there's another yet broader study that's going on right now, and that is, and it's controversial, that is many folks are beginning, myself included, to look at our research and writing around restorative justice as a social justice movement. And what do we mean by that? Not only is can it enhance, and in fact maybe reform, but even transform systems like schools and the courts and so on, but it is shifting the cultural attitude in a way that we believe might offer more hope for us to see justice in new ways and change the institutions that we currently have in ways that feel more effective. So what is the core? When I'm on an airplane, someone says, what do you do? What's my elevator speech? So let me give it to you. It's that the current system, and I in no means want to insinuate the current system isn't complex and sophisticated and very effective in some ways. But I want to also say that much of the current legal system, the Western legal system, which is what we're talking about now here in this country, and some other countries it mirrors closely, tends to focus on the offender, the person who's caused the harm, and how to blame them. And it tends to then focus on punishment. So we look at blame and the administration of pain. That's a very simple way, but it's a way to grab our attention. Restorative justice asks a set of different questions. It says, who has been harmed? What are the needs that have arisen from that harm? There's trauma, there's all sorts of other needs that may arise from a harm. And who or what institution or individual is responsible or obligated to try to repair the harm? When you ask those three questions, they may sound simple. When you put those three questions together and you get all of the different stakeholders or actors that have been involved in a harm or affected by a harm together, and you seriously go through those questions, the outcome could look quite different than our current criminal legal system. And so it's important to note that asking different questions brings different outcomes. And so that's what we're after here when we talk about restorative justice. And there's a whole set of practices attached to it. And I could talk to some of those. There's victim offender conferencing or dialogue, which is bringing the actual parties in the harm and the harm doer together to actually work this out face to face. There are multiple other means of working with larger groups or organizations or communities in circle, which is a particular process with particular skills and the need for very mature facilitation. There is application of this now being applied across universities in this country for student conduct issues And it's in schools, K through 12, as opposed to the regular discipline. There's a whole new set of ways in which we're understanding restorative justice to build a new school culture, a whole school system that is much more effective, we believe, in educating our children in this regard. There are applications to sex offenders. Some of the folks that we're told by the experts are the hardest to rehabilitate. There are then applications, as I mentioned, even in transitional justice, which is the macro international war to peace transitions. And we're seeing effective application as whole countries are trying to move through very, very serious, egregious violence. And so I'm just opening that up so that it can expand our audience's imagination around this thing called restorative justice. So restorative justice says, we don't want to focus on the offender only. We want to look at the victim who is often left out. The survivors and the communities that are hurt by the harms are often left out of our current system. We bring them in. We bring the community in. Who do we mean by the community? The support networks, the extended family, as well as the services in the community to be part of the justice equation. And if the state is involved, as in the criminal legal system, we involve the state, but we give them not a privileged position, but a place at the table with the offender, the victim, and the community. And as each one comes around the table, there's particular responsibilities and obligations, but we believe justice can be served, and it can be served in a much more inexpensive and deeply participatory, which gives the community an ownership to this process called justice. Thalia, maybe you want to jump in.
Yeah. So I think, so thank you, Carl, for setting that framework and to give, I think, a complimentary sort of initial introduction. I too found myself situated around this work in the criminal legal system back in 2001 in Chicago, and really had the privilege of working with folks that are considered the grandmothers of this work in Chicago, Orshra and Cheryl Graves. And that was as it existed within the criminal legal system that time, it was for juveniles, and it was not what we think about as the traditional continuum within the criminal legal system, moving from, say, diversion at that pre-trial, pre-adjudication stage to, say, sentencing, parole, probation, and community reentry. But it was while young folks were being held in confinement in a temporary juvenile facility and actually given the opportunity and space to really re-engage with what their humanity and dignity was. And so loosely defined as a program called Girl Talk. And that was before we had this larger sort of set of language around what is or what is not restorative justice, and even using those words. But it was really, I think, to Carl's point about saying, how do we recognize there's a different framework and a different set of relationships and webs in which we're interconnected? Because restorative justice, again, is asking not just from the concept of crime or harm about a set of individuals, but how have we broken apart a web of social relationships? And I think that matters because it also really asks us to interrogate whether or not a value-driven set of practices can truly exist within a state-sponsored institution that in and of itself has not let go of a punitive approach, right? So is the placement of restorative practices, as Carl mentioned, victim offender mediation, conferencing, dialogue, circle practice, going to achieve something for us that's truly restorative if it still sits within a state-sponsored entity, meaning that it sits as diversion within a particular program that you are then mandatorily required to attend, or perhaps voluntarily required to attend, depending on your jurisdiction and what the law says, or how that's being interpreted in a particular way. So I think those are the other questions that we really have to ask ourselves, is that within the context of moving to a restorative framework, how and where do we have an approach that is, say, deeply community-centered and has that ownership lying with the community because the community is concerned with that social fabric, moving all the way up to even state-level policy and figuring out how do we operationalize that on the ground and what is the fidelity of practice to that? Because there is nothing worse than putting the label of something restorative on any type of practice and actually doing more harm than good, right? There is never a time where we should call something restorative justice when we're actually just replicating structures of subordination. That is not equity work. That is not justice work. And so being really clear about the attention to those both programmatic and pragmatic details, but really what is the set of values that are being adopted and furthering the work, right? There has to be an aim and a consistent attention to what that aim looks like. So I think, we've been talking now for about 15 minutes. And I think it's worth a pause because we need to share this floor because again, we can't intuit what you might want to know or how we could best be of service in this conversation. So I'd love to open up. I don't see questions in the chat, but I'm also a fan of the good old wave if that's where we'd like to go.
Thalia, thank you so much, and I apologize for mispronouncing your name earlier. So if you have questions, you can either put them in the chat or send them to Kateri. And Kateri, do you have a question for our speakers?
Yes. So the first question that I'd like to ask maybe both of the speakers to answer was that, so what can an ordinary person do in order to implement facets of restorative justice into their lives and interactions? And I'll write that out in the chat as well.
Thalia, why don't you take that first?
Sure. I mean, I think this is to Carl's point is that, I mean, there's a whole set of ways in which we might think about living more restoratively. What are the ways that we start to think about how we address conflict? Do we, how do we name what conflict and harm is? What are the practices that we implement? I have a 3.5, soon to be 4-year-old daughter. I am regularly engaging in restorative justice in my house, right? Because it's the ways in which I have to think about, one, how is the language that I use? How am I trying to normatively shift her behavior towards something that I might think is right? And how am I mirroring, taking accountability for my own behaviors that have caused a particular situation? That, I mean, those are the simple ways that are about affirming restorative values. I think also from a restorative standpoint, it's thinking about how and where are we deeply concerned with what this whole summer, but certainly a lot of other social movement work has emphasized is the level of structural subordination and injustice that is embedded in anti-Blackness. The violence that is perpetrated against Black Americans, and then as that extends to other marginalized communities, is something that we simply can't ignore. And as we choose to do that socially, and even within our own sort of political spheres, so, individual moral spheres, that's not being restorative. We're not being attentive to larger questions about equity. So from a basic framework, being restorative or living restoratively or imbuing our lives with restorative justice is the one-on-one interactions. What are the relationships that we choose to maintain? How do we maintain those? And are those done in a way that affirms the human dignity of all people? Or is it about just perpetuating a set of privilege that we might already exist? Now, that's not a comfortable topic, right? And that might not be something that you're sort of ready to grapple with perhaps in your own lives. But I think to the example of my daughter, those are the things that you can very much start to control and sort of conceptualize, like, how am I engaging that conflict resolution? How am I thinking about affirming the dignity of others? What are my resilience strategies? How and where am I connected, not just to say like peers in a collegial sense, but then in a larger community? Like how do I position myself within thinking about Arlington? What is my role in place and space, and what does that look like? So I think those are all ways in which we, across a whole set of more personal and intrapersonal ways, could think about being restorative as we live, which is very much different from like a structural systemic approach in that context. But Carl, I don't know what else you'd add.
I'll just jump in real quickly. You started at parenting. I think I would say the same. My wife and I have grown children, 28 and 30, but we started family meetings. We didn't call them restorative justice, but we called family meetings at 8 and 10, where everything was on the table. I mean, not everything. They had to sleep and eat and a few other things, but other things could be dialogued and talked about. And that was a place where we emptied in a lot of our frustrations and concerns as a family. And we had everyone leading that meeting at different points. So there's ways to do that in your immediate family. I would encourage anyone who can get training of any kind around restorative justice to do that if you can, and then begin to think about where is the application of this, because what we're seeing is nurses are applying this when there's conflict in the nursing station, in the nursing unit. We're finding folks in the environmental movement now beginning to say, hey, how do we understand the environment as something, as a justice issue, and how do we restore the environment? So restorative justice is becoming a component there. We're finding folks that are saying, hey, this is a new way of relating within my activist community, because in the past, we activists sometimes have beat each other up in our pursuit of peace and tranquility. And so what does it mean for us to hold each other in a new way and talk about issues in a different and structured way that's more equity driven? And what that means is we have to think about handling our conflicts in different ways, not in the formal ways maybe we've always been taught or through our organizational system, but in informal ways, and yet in ways that are—
Carl, can you give an example of what that means?
like an actual, okay, let me give an example. When we teach in our graduate school, we have students from all over the world, and they come together, and our core courses can have up to 25, 30 people. These are people from many different cultures. We've got the whole diversity mix there. And we know that it's bound to come up in the community that we're trying to build. There's going to be conflicts, there's going to be microaggressions, there's going to be harm said. We don't just go on teaching and hope they can deal with it outside of the classroom. We stop, because we're talking about peace building and restorative justice. We may stop our agenda as professors and actually sit in a circle with our students to say, hey, let's name what just happened here. Let's name what just transpired here, and let's talk about it as a group and figure out what are the norms that we want to have in our class in regards to these issues. That might be one example.
Thalia, did you want to address the question?
No, I mean, I actually see that there's a fair amount of that coming up in the chat, and so I just want to be cognizant of that as well.
Yeah, so Kateri, do you want to call out another question?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so this is from a restorative justice student. So she has learned about a couple of the different kind of perspectives on restorative justice. So individual level, such as satisfaction with the outcomes of the process, getting answers to questions they wouldn't have gotten from the criminal process. But she's also read criticisms of restorative justice and getting those individual wins without making systemic or institutional level changes is not narrow or maybe not possible. So her question to the speakers is, do you see a way of reconciling kind of the two perspectives of individual and institutional approaches to enacting restorative justice in a community maybe like Arlington?
Sure, I'm happy to answer that. I mean, they're not in opposition. They should actually be done at the same simultaneously, right? So you can't simply just say we have a restorative justice program, for example, right, that's attached to the criminal justice system. And so in that instance, you have a program, you go to that program, and perhaps then there's a positive set of outcomes. So that individual victim satisfaction is most commonly measured. And I think the individual asked a question pointed to that. If you don't simultaneously build the infrastructure relative to policy, and in particular relative to law, then you aren't going to see the structural and systemic change. So you can't just simply have an ad hoc program that allows for discretionary decision making that, say, an individual prosecutor or an individual judge can ultimately just funnel whomever they want into it. You need to have a set of laws and policies in place that indicate that present all of those other things and build the scaffolding around it. So for example, like in our current American criminal system, we have 264 laws that actually address restorative justice. Now, don't take that to mean that they all address it substantively. So to the extent, right, some of those laws deal with how and where procedurally this might apply in a juvenile context in juvenile matters, or how this might apply in an adult context. We have several states like Colorado, Vermont, Nebraska, where we've seen what is more of an infrastructure that has been built around trying to have a systemic approach to what that is. And so that's how you remedy that tension, is you don't just look for a set of programs that might be implemented as a one-off, where you're really thinking about the individualized level, you're thinking about rewriting the whole thing. And I would actually advocate that when you're doing that, you flip it. So you follow, for example, a New Zealand model where restorative is the primacy, meaning it is not the alternative, because that's actually our construction right now within the American criminal justice system. We don't start from a restorative place, we start from a punitive place, and then perhaps there's a restorative option that's available to you, either because of discretionary decision-making or because at a local jurisdictional level, someone has decided to do that, even though it's not in state law. Whereas in New Zealand, right, they completely overhauled their juvenile justice system and said, we start from a restorative approach, and then in the event we truly have to have what looks like a punitive approach, then that only exists in a few small set of instances. We do the complete opposite of that. So if you want to talk then about restorative justice being, quote, transformative, to get into a bit of that sort of tension and discourse around those two different words and the ways in which people might attach to them as one being structural change and one not being structural change, that's how you have to think about building that out in totality.
Great answer, thanks. Just so everyone knows, any questions that are put into the chat, we're going to be collecting and capturing all the answers. So whatever questions aren't answered tonight, we'll be creating a frequently asked question document and sending it out to everyone who registered. So any question you put in, even if it doesn't get answered tonight, it will get answered and by our experts, and the answers will be shared with you at a later date. Kateria, did you have another question?
Yeah, I had an interesting one about kind of specific offenses so this person specifically asked about sex offenders, and I'd like to expand the question. So for example, in crimes that, people can, there's not really an argument, something like sex offense is inherently bad, right? And so how can we look at approaches for sex offenders or similar crimes from a restorative justice perspective, knowing what we do about how a lot of sex offenders have been abused themselves and have no safe place to go for help? How can we address that in the restorative justice framework?
So Carl, could we give a two-part answer where you talk about what the work on the ground might look like, and then I talk about how the laws have actually dealt with this or not?
Absolutely.
Great.
That's a really important question. And let me be clear. I have a social work background and a peace building and restorative justice background too. This is not something we go into lightly, and we know full well that from a professional view, there's often a lot of discouragement around any sort of alternative dispute resolution processes, if you want to call restorative justice part of that in these sorts of cases, precisely because of the power imbalance and the potential for manipulation and so on. So we're very aware of those. We would not enter those in a restorative justice manner without a very clear communal and family support system, number one, and number two, without a clear sense of what the process will be that will hopefully balance the power. And of course, making sure that the person who has been victimized is now in a safe place and a secure place. So there's a lot of issues that would need to be thought about before any process would be undertaken. And second of all, not all the processes we're talking about are going to involve face-to-face or in-person interaction between the harmed and the harm doer. So for instance, one of the processes I'm talking about is actually after sex offenders have maybe served some time and are coming back into the community. And the reintegration process, we know, is very difficult for anyone coming out of the criminal justice system back into the community for so many reasons, and I'm happy to talk about those. But for sex offenders, there's even a greater stigma attached to their reentry back into the community. So one of the processes is called COSA, Communities of Support and Accountability. This is a very intensive, volunteer-based community and family, sometimes religious organizations, who volunteers choose to come around the person who's being reintegrated back into the community and provide as a liaison to the community, to social services in the community, to helping them find a job, housing, etc., but also meeting with them regularly and holding them accountable for their behavior. And usually that's a very intensive process for at least a year before there's a little bit more autonomy in that process. And so that may involve engaging not only social services and the community at large, but some folks who are concerned about it from a victim side. But that would only be if the victim or the victim or the harmed party is interested in any kind of engagement. And that could take many forms. It could take letter writing, it could take video dialogue that doesn't involve meeting in person if folks are not ready. Let's be clear, restorative justice does not work unless the parties are willing to come together. So if we have a harmed party that says, absolutely not, I will not be in the same room with this person, I'm not prepared to talk to them, I'm deeply traumatized, I'm deeply troubled, we're not gonna be pushing this process in that situation. We're gonna have to work on other ways in which we begin to think about restoration at that point. So when we think about sex offenders, we have to think about that in quite broad sense. Now, let me say this, the first point I made about community and familial support, what is very interesting is to see how Indigenous communities, particularly First Nations communities in Canada, and if there's a whole video on Hollow Water, which is the name of a particular community, who asked the Crown in Canada to be able to handle their own justice issues within the community using their indigenous processes, which they call peacemaking circles, which have a lot in common with restorative justice, but they have another name for it. But they used those peacemaking circles in some of the most difficult incest cases. Now, I'm not encouraging that, but they have the community resources to be able to do that and make a significant impact in their communities. It's a fascinating story to see the power of this if a community wants to embrace these values in their fullest sense. Thalia?
Sure. So, so across the country, lawmakers and policymakers have grappled with the question about something relative to sexual harm and sexual violence, and actually a whole range of other cases. And there's categorical exemptions in law that restorative practices are just not available as first diversion. So there's not going to be the instance where someone is offered, for example, as diversion, as opposed to going through an adjudicatory process, a restorative process, if they are if they have been accused, right? If they have been accused of, say, committing rape or murder, right? Or actually variant forms of manslaughter. So as a set of, pragmatically speaking, right, from a legal standpoint, like there are these exemptions that exist across the country, and I would be surprised, right, if Arlington decided that they want to go against that and suddenly create a set of new ways in which that would happen. So when Carl's talking about this work, or you're thinking about this work, then as it's been studied in other examples, and there's actually a fair amount of empirical literature about domestic violence. There's been, other studies that have dealt with sexual harm, sexual violence, Mary Koss's work and others, and certainly it could be directed towards that to think about what is the empirical research base about the efficacy of these types of programs. It's all being done as an adjacent to an existing criminal legal system structure. So you're not running into sort of that place of conflict, I think raises a lot of concerns for individuals, and rightly so, sort of how is this operating as this quasi or not legal system within our justice system as well. But I do want to put a flag in something that Carl said, which is really important, which is about the voluntary versus mandatory participation, because that's something that as community members, you really want to think about what is the structure that then is put into policy and into law affirmatively relative to restorative practices. Across the country, there is variation. There are states where restorative justice is voluntary for both those that have been harmed, the victims, and those that have caused harm, the offenders. In fact, it's universally always voluntary for victims, but it's not true for offenders. There's many states where it's actually mandatory that you participate, which raises a whole set of questions about coercion, right? And where and how are people being forced to participate in something where they're trading potential rights away too by not going through a formal justice system. Whether you like our criminal justice system or not, we do have constitutional protections that exist in the Fifth and the Sixth Amendment in particular, in ways that individuals can protect themselves against the fact that it is actually a deeply subversive and subordinating system. And we don't want restorative justice to somehow replicate that or take those protections away. So, from a best practices standpoint, how and where are you crafting policies? How are you thinking? There's only one restorative justice law in the relative to criminal law in Virginia, just so that we're clear, right? So how are you thinking about your own structures to really avoid some of these, what I would argue are very significant pitfalls that exist in other jurisdictions? This voluntary versus mandatory is one that aligns with both theory, but I think also aligns with best practice.
Maybe piggybacking on that, I don't want to jump ahead, but I do see a question that says something about, is punishment never appropriate in restorative justice? Let me just speak to that. I think it's really important. It's not that some people have accused restorative justice of somehow being soft or easy or a mercy-based program only. We're very clear that while we center the victim, the one who's been harmed and been affected the most, while their voice is centered in the process, the one who has harmed is also asked to be part of that process for sure. And I like to use the word accountability, whether you like it or not. I think that's a much more appropriate word. Certainly not opposed to holding people accountable. We're certainly not opposed to consequences and feeling the consequences. We're certainly not opposed to a certain amount of internal reflection that may bring people to the point where they feel like they need to change, and restitution and reparation becomes a really important part of that. So It might be monetary, it might be symbolic or otherwise. These are all important aspects of what I would keep under the umbrella of restorative justice by all means. But as I said, I tend to think about accountability. And accountability, people can be held accountable for actions or behaviors that have harmed in many different ways. And this is where the creativity of restorative justice becomes really critical to this conversation.
That's a great response. Kateri, do you have another question from our audience?
Yes. Sorry, I'm just looking for it. So this is a question that I'm gonna quote her. Seems to me that many communities would have a natural interest in restorative justice. I suspect you've also run into private and political forces that actually prefer the status quo, especially for economic reasons. How do you approach that competing agenda?
I think it depends on how and where. So it's a couple of things. One, it's to Carl's initial point about what is the current status of a sort of social political norm change that's happening within a community, right? And schools are a great microcosm of this. There are schools where you have teachers, administrators, educators who understand that exclusionary school discipline policies, zero tolerance, are actually deeply harmful, not just because you might push a child into the school to prison pipeline, but because the somatic and psychosomatic, right? The bodily and the neurological responses to school exclusion mirror trauma. So if you measure brain waves and you look at those kinds of indicators, you actually start to see that they also then have real health implications. So then from that standpoint, you're actually able to talk to an audience that this isn't about, say, being soft on kids in a classroom. This is about long-term public health impacts of a community. And so then it becomes a conversation about health, right? And it becomes a conversation about how schools are an important social determinant of health. And if we don't continue to educate young people, it's not just will they get their high school degree and live 6 to 11 years longer, which is what the data tells us, but will they be able to actually effectively contribute to the larger community? So in some ways, right, it's about meeting people where they're at and being able to say restorative justice, one, is not a panacea. Two, especially in law, the current architecture is really the floor, not where we should start, not the ceiling. And then what is it that might align with the other interests that exist? Your point about economic reasons is an interesting one, because where we've seen the greatest spike in restorative justice laws being passed was in 2008. And when you then cross-reference that, it was because state legislatures were trying to deal with the fact that their budgets were in crisis and they needed to not have so many people moving into the criminal justice system because it's incredibly expensive to incarcerate, right? It's about $182 billion a year for our current carceral system. And so if you want to start to deal with the economic ramifications of mass incarceration, you start to increase your diversion programs. And so that's what we saw. We saw both a rise on the ground of diversion programs for juveniles in particular, but then we also saw like laws actually being passed that would allow this to occur. So, again, it's like organizing. Know your community, sort of know what their needs and interests are, do a basic needs assessment, and then start to think about how does restorative justice fit into those needs and interests so that you can start to have those conversations. I think it's always really important to have the data behind you. And I don't just say that as a researcher and in particular, someone who advances empirical work as well as theoretical work, because it's the place and space where you can start to really talk with folks about like, oh, okay, you want to think about about victim satisfaction. Let's think about victim satisfaction relative to 40 years of research on victim offender mediation. Those individuals that have been harmed by others don't find the criminal justice system, by and large, right, to actually address their needs and feel like they've healed. Okay, well, what's then an alternative to what that exists like? So I don't know, Susan, if that answers your question, but to the extent, right, thinking about how and where we start to understand restorative justice as a framework and a set of practices that really becomes interlocking with all of the other things that we might be trying to achieve in a given community. It should never just be a standalone or sort of isolated thing or a phenomenon, right? It's about how you embed it. It's in that sense, right, thinking about equity, that's another good example. When you talk about workforce development, why is it that practitioners in many instances have to have a particular set of degrees behind them. Well, that's about replicating subordination. That's about keeping doors closed to folks who otherwise didn't have access to education. So you can be reoriented. You know, you can be talking about workforce development. You can be thinking about how you're reaching into and developing the capacity and leadership skills in communities that otherwise have been bereft of that. So, you know, think about who your audience is, and then think about how and where restorative justice broadly and then very targeted fits into some of that.
I wanted to ask one of the questions that was put into the chat. It was interesting to me is, could you give us, and I think both of you, could you give us some examples, specific examples on how we could use restorative justice here in Arlington? So right now, Leanne, who's on the call, thanks Leanne, is working on a plan that would have restorative justice occur in our criminal court system, in our schools, and also in our community. And I was wondering perhaps if you could just touch on any one of those to give us some hard, just like, here's what it would look like, so that folks understand and can relate to what it would be like in their neighborhoods. In any one of those.
Carl, you want to give one? I'll give another.
Sure. Let me just and sort of piggyback on what you were just speaking about too a little bit. I think often we're forced into a conversation by the system or whatever to sort of talk about, do we change the system from within or do we change the system from without? I think that's a false dichotomy. I tell my students, listen, you know, wherever you can position yourself, if you've got the restorative vision and you can start to make changes, we need you in and we need you out. We need parallel processes that are showing that justice can occur in the community without the criminal legal involvement or the police involvement. But we also need to have folks inside the system who are beginning to work away at the legislation and other things that we're talking about here so that the system can begin to shift. And so we've got the reformists and the revolutionaries on both sides. We've got to talk to each other instead of throwing stones at each other and begin to think about how do we work together in this agenda. That being said, some of the examples, for instance, in Chicago, there's a network of restorative justice hubs. These are hubs in some of the most difficult parts of the city. When I say difficult, high crime, if you will, areas of the city where there's been a lot of disadvantaged economic and other systems and racist systems and so on. But what some of these groups have been doing in these hubs, first of all, they're providing space for youth to gather. And one of their commitments, they have a set of values that they ask every partner in the hub to commit to, is that this will be a police-free zone. That doesn't mean that, you know, if something really, really drastic happened, they wouldn't have to involve some others. But what they're saying is we're going to handle conflicts within the zone when the youth are here after school or whenever, doing whatever they're doing, and they've set the agenda. We're going to handle those conflicts in a restorative way without calling on outside authority to come in and take over in sometimes very abusive and painful and harmful ways on their own. The other thing that was really revolutionary, and I heard a young man speaking about this at age 19, he joined, they had open community circles where they literally just opened the circle to the community. Anyone could drop in off of into a community center or wherever they're holding it and sit in circle and talk about the issues that they were concerned about in their community. What happened is this began to be a place. This began to be a place for politics. This began to be a place for organizing. This began to be a place to talk about how do we care about our community and how do we want to see it differently. And so this young man, who is now a facilitator of these circles, said he joined when he was 14, spent 2 years laughing at his buddies because they looked like they were he was part of just on the fringes of the gang, and his buddies looked like they were getting to just, you know, pansies or whatever. They were working outside of their, you know, they were suddenly making other decisions and changing the way they were living. And finally, then he realized, hey, they're changing their lives in positive ways in the community. I want to do the same. At 16, he seriously up, and by 19, he was running these circles in the community. But this is a community building process of looking at how do we as a community want to take back our communities and not rely on the authorities to tell us what and how to do, and to surveil and control our behaviors and find ways to rebuild our community and sort of own, if you will, the conflicts or the harms that have occurred in the community. And of course, we know with the burgeoning movement of transformative justice, which is a sister justice movement that restorative justice must stay in conversation with, and there are many overlaps, is beginning to think about how do communities keep themselves safe and secure without necessarily always relying on authority. And so I would just say in Arlington, let's encourage restorative practices wherever we're seeing the potential for harms. It doesn't have to be legal harms. It could be other harms in different sectors, environmental, school, as we've already mentioned. Let's get trained, let's understand the process, and then let's have folks available to begin to work with this. Medical, New Zealand's working at using restorative justice to deal with medical lawsuits that came out of malpractice situations in one particular use of a medical mesh. And there was many thousands or hundreds of folks who had had serious malpractice issues with that. And they actually held restorative processes with those who had been affected, the medical practitioners and the Department of Health in New Zealand. Fascinating model, wouldn't necessarily easily happen here, but these are the kinds of creative thinking I think we need to push towards.
Sure, I'd say pragmatically for any of you that's a parent or happens to know a kid, what would this look like in a school right now? It would be virtual circles, right? And that actually has nothing to do with discipline. So let's be really clear. I'm actually not talking about the relationship between restorative justice and school discipline, though that is the most common association that we seem to be making. And that makes sense, right? It comes out of a civil rights framework. We've been, racial disparities, gender disparities, how and where young people are experiencing a disproportionate effect of school discipline looks a particular way. But that's only a very small sliver of what restorative justice in schools looks like. So right now, your young person that you know, either your kiddo or someone else's, could be sitting in circle, right? Those could be led by their peers, or those could be led by their teachers. And that could be the mechanism, right, of helping to bridge the gaps between disassociation that's existed over this time of not being together for purposes of COVID-19 and the safety measures that we need to take. It could also be a place and space where there are affinity groups. So thinking about what is the identity of a particular student and how they're coming together based on their identity so that they can have a shared space that starts to then say, address things like social capital, resilience, right? For young women in particular, right? It's also now thinking about what is the psychological safety that they might need because of the unique experiences that women and girls face within our society, given patriarchy, and how those intersect. So there's all kinds of ways that restorative justice can exist in a school, which is about a proactive, supportive model that builds social emotional literacy skills, that really thinks about what is a positive school climate and builds connectedness. And I don't just mean connectedness as school connectedness, like a young person to a teacher, but with peers and even with their families. And that's bared out in the research. Like, that's really clear that those are ways in which restorative justice can exist. But at a very basic level, you might see that young person sitting in a screen very much like this, as many of you probably did, V circles that I know Leanne has been spearheading and others, where it's just that moment to reconnect with each other in a deeply disconnected time. Now, that could also look like in schools now, or as we move forward to more and more in-person learning, as that is now sitting coupled with a revamp of your school discipline policy. Your school discipline policy now no longer relies perhaps heavily or even marginally on exclusionary school discipline as the mechanism to address the ways in which young people might act. We have seriously changed the way we perceive young people's behavior since the 1980s. And we have now characterized and classified the ways in which young people act like young people, foolish young people whose frontal lobes are growing and changing on a regular basis, and put that into a very criminalized context. And so, that would be then from a policy standpoint. What does that mean for teachers? That means having professional development time, as Carl mentioned, allocated towards not just training because they themselves need to be doing the practice, but really being about a whole school approach, so that when they're in conflict with each other, because what's worse than adults mirroring bad practices for young people? Not much. Then when they're in conflict with each other, then they're able to do that. So for example, I worked with a school and I wrote a case study with a teacher over 7 years where that's how they would run their faculty meetings, their meetings for students, not just for students, but for everyone in the building. And so teachers, that's how their faculty meetings would run. They would use restorative practices when there were conflicts between administrators and teachers. And it was really about modeling a set of behaviors for young folks to say, if we expect you to act this way, we will act this way too. So those are sort of very pragmatic ways that it could look like, both now in this COVID world, but then in a post-COVID world as we start to come back to a new normal in that way. I'm happy to think about it relative to the criminal legal system, but again, I'm attentive to the fact that I keep seeing the red, like, new messages popping up.
So let's take some more questions.
Terry, do you have another question?
Yeah, I was actually hoping that quickly we could just spend one more minute talking about schools and maybe talk about how restorative justice could replace or look at the concept of SROs in public schools. Kind of whether RJ has an alternative or what.
In Arlington, SROs are school resource officers,
Resource officers.
police officers detailed into the buildings.
Mm-hmm. So right now, there's a continuum of how that looks in schools. So some schools have SROs, some schools don't have SROs. Some schools, like here in LA, we have school resource officers, we have sheriffs, and we have LAPD. So if you're really lucky, you get all three of those folks on your campus at a given time. Those are the gold star moments. So how, and this is separate from the defunding police movement, and so we can talk about that and put a pin in that, but I think there's a lot of nascency to sort of what that looks like. So there's a couple of things. So in some instances, states have passed this, but then also there's been local movement to actually have school resource officers trained in restorative practices, right? So it's going back to a more traditional model of community policing. In fact, the original evolution of school resource officers was actually to place someone in the building that didn't look like, and I don't just mean phenotypically, didn't act, look, smell, etc., like a traditional police officer on the street, that they were actually not there to be policing them in the same way that an officer on the street would be, say, perhaps concerned with upholding the ways in which sort of crime and law, etc., exist. They were there to assume more of a parents patriae role in the way that teachers and others in the building did. Now that's true actually in places, whether we like that or not. I think we homogeneously like to talk about SROs, but my colleague Monique Morris, who writes deeply about the experiences of Black girls in the school to prison pipeline in schools, did a complete research project with Georgetown, where in the center that I work in as well, in the Deep South. And the viewpoint on students was actually that SROs were really valuable there because it wasn't about serving a policing function. It was actually about serving a community function, and that there was a deep connection to them as individuals. And in fact, in some ways, a replication of a parental figure. So, in that instance, it's about saying, what does the school community need? If your school community has a really great SRO who that's the way that they have been acculturated and normalized into the community, simply asking them to leave actually isn't necessarily going to be the best move for that community. And in fact, it might mean that students feel like they've had someone who they had a relationship stripped away from them, and that's problematic. So in that instance, having them trained in restorative practices, which probably is something that they're already doing, they're just not calling it that, makes a difference. And there are laws across the country where that's actually what's mandated, and there's been funding put aside. Now, there are many places that school resource officers do those sort of a function that is about perpetuating punitive discipline and then ultimately funneling students into the school to prison pipeline. In that instance, right, removing that authority, limiting the scope by which they can then be criminalizing the non-criminal behaviors of young people is really important. But that's not about restorative justice per se, right? That's not about at least the practice of restorative justice. Now that's about a restorative justice philosophy in the sense that you're advocating from a place of equity, dignity, relationships, right? Ensuring the safety and efficacy of young people in that context. So that's a school where I would be more deeply concerned with having those individuals not there, not having the option or the constant option of the use of exclusionary school discipline policies by anyone in the building. Because we have to remind ourselves, and this is where I will come back to the defunding police movement, taking cops off of campuses doesn't mean that campuses will immediately, one, be safe, or school discipline will not exist anymore. Because by and large, the individuals that get to make the decisions on an hourly and daily basis about who does go to in-school suspension, who gets kicked out of school, whether that's an out-of-school suspension or an expulsion, is not a police officer. It's not an SRO. It's a teacher. It's a disciplinarian. It's some other decision maker who's in the hierarchy of that individual school and is adjacent to the criminal legal system. So unless there is an incident that happens on campus that behavior rises to something that's criminal, that SRO, even if they're on that campus, may have nothing to do with it, and that kid will still go to ISS. in-school suspension. That kid may see a 3 to 5 day out of the classroom, right? So when we're talking, and this goes back to the original sort of some of these early questions, when we're talking about advancing a restorative framework, we can't just pick and choose one or two things, or we really won't see the totality of change. And I think that's an important place and space. There's going to be all of these overlapping areas where we can be doing small and big things. But it's, again, you've got to have individual behavioral change coupled with policy, coupled with practice, and then a constant going back to high accountability and then high supports, right? Like if you've seen the discipline window, right? I'm sort of drawing it out for you as if you could see it in that moment, right? It's in that box where we hit the sweet spot, right, of high support and high accountability. That's actually where we all thrive, not just young people, not just students. And that's the restorative space.
That's a great response. Thank you.
Okay, next question.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead, Guitar?
Okay, I'd like to talk a little bit more about kind of the intersection of our traditional, like what we have now, our criminal justice system and a restorative framework, and kind of where we can hit along the way to that, maybe specific to a small community like Arlington. For an example might be helpful. I have a couple questions who are talking about if is the person harmed the one who would decide if they would want to pursue a restorative approach or the criminal justice system? Is it a choice or just one way? How are they incorporated together? Does restorative justice imply that punishment is never appropriate? What if the victim and community feel strongly that the person who caused the harm should be punished in a traditional way, such as jail time or fines? And when holding the harmed accountable, is prison ever appropriate? So if the speakers could kind of just, address that intersection between our traditional criminal justice system and a restorative framework.
Sure.
So I can talk about one pretty quickly if you want.
Go ahead.
So as our laws and policies exist right now, there is not going to be a time where the person who's harmed has control over the restorative justice process fully. And by that I mean it is the criminal justice system is a state-sanctioned system. And that means that you're going to have to either, so if I'm a victim and I feel like it would be really important for my healing, I have to ask the state, maybe that's the prosecutor, maybe that's a judge, maybe that's the Department of Corrections, depending on where the person who harmed me is in their trajectory along that continuum of the system. I'm going to have to say to them, I want that. And then they're going to make a decision as to whether or not that can exist. And so I have autonomy, right? And I have decision-making authority, but it's always going to be subject to the desires, whims, powers of the state in that context, because the ultimate decision-making authority lies with the state as it's associated with the criminal justice system. So what that means, right, is that if you don't want that to be the case, then those processes should exist outside of the state system, right? So where and how you want to have restorative and healing processes relative to harm for individuals who've been harmed, don't look to the state to be the place where you can then have all the autonomy to do that. So I'm happy to talk about that more if there's follow-up questions, but I'll yield the floor to Carl to now think about 2 or 3 or some combination as we answer those as well. But I want that to be clear, that there's, even where there is the ability for victims to be involved, they still have to ask, and they may not get that ask granted in that instance.
Right. As long as punitive response is the default, we will be in that situation. In other words, we would like to imagine, for instance, it's possible New Zealand, as Thalia mentioned earlier, has actually their entire juvenile justice system. The restorative approach is first, it's the default and then follows, but that's a whole nother story, and you have to have the political will and the political climate for that type of thing to go forward. A few of the questions that were in there, we've sort of talked to, like about punishment and accountability. Let me just say something about where the origin of the ask comes from. There have been certainly those who've caused the harm, offenders, asking for a restorative justice process. That is one place, but we would never, even if they're asking for it and we think they could really benefit from it, I'm talking about the offender or the harm doer, if the one who's been harmed simply does not want to participate, we simply can't make that happen. And so we'd have to hold back unless all parties agreed to that process, and then the system agreed to allow that process to go forward. Now it is happening. People are going into prisons. The victim are harmed, and their support networks and facilitators with persons who are serving time inside to have these conversations. That's happening in some states. Other ways they're doing it is persons inside may write a letter of apology and so on, asking for a restorative justice process. It'll never be sent directly to the victim. It would be sent through a victim's advocate or victim services office. The person harmed will be notified that there's a letter from the person who caused the harm in their family, but there would be no pressure for them to come and read it if they do not want to. So we're trying to keep as far away from the re-triggering of the trauma of the original harm as possible. And so many of the things I'm talking about would of course be re-traumatizing if we weren't careful. There was another question about what happens if there's a surprise outcome, the victim or the surviving families or whatever really want a very harsh outcome from the process. We would not have engaged in a restorative justice process and been surprised to that point. In other words, preparation. So this is where training comes really importantly. Before we would bring anyone together for this kind of conversation, we would first of all do quite a bit of preparatory meeting and discerning and looking at levels of trauma and that sort of thing, especially for higher level crime or harm doing. And that is for the purpose of trying to keep and make sure that everyone's willing and voluntarily coming to the process, but also to keep us from as many surprises as possible. And so if you're surprised in the middle of a meeting with the response of the victim, then probably the prep hasn't been done well enough. Now on smaller offenses, the prep time may take less, but still we want to check in and make sure folks are coming to the table with as much goodwill as possible in a very difficult situation.
I had a question. We're coming up to, it's 7 o'clock, and we were going to go for a few more minutes, and then if you had questions, we were going to try to address as many as possible. But could you, both of you, put a dollar number to the savings of restorative justice as compared to punitive justice? What could what's been saved, and or what's been, how does this measure out in dollars and cents? I've had that question asked me by a lot of people.
Sure.
I mean, I think if you take the number I gave you before, thinking about what was it? It's over $200 billion that we spend on mass incarceration, and we take even 10% of that. You could certainly attribute that to in thinking about how restorative practices might save us money. I mean, I think it's hard because when you talk about schools, I'm not sure how to economically measure what is it that you feel safe in your school community to the point where you don't drop out, right? And I actually think that this is a real disservice relative to asking what is the efficacy of restorative justice. Putting a dollar amount on someone's dignity, putting a dollar amount on feeling whole, I think is a really dangerous proposition. In the same way that I think that there are incredible mixed methodology approaches to examining restorative justice, and I think it's really problematic when we suggest that the gold standard looks like forcing a certain set of people into restorative processes and not having a certain set of people in restorative processes so we can come up with some sort of neutral observation about whether it's good or bad. Right. So for those of you that have followed, in some instances, there was a study a couple of years ago that was done by the RAND Institute of IARP, the International Institute of Restorative Practices, work in schools. It was a second-year study, and it was that type of a study, and it had a whole set of outcomes that people got deeply concerned about. Where after 1 year, there's a finding that middle school students' test scores didn't go up. Well, I would argue that there's a whole host of other factors and drivers that you cannot exclusively then isolate restorative justice as the phenomenon that is therefore either increasing or decreasing test scores, not just in 1 year, but over a totality of time. So I think part of this is asking ourselves, not just what is the dollar amount that we put on restorative justice, but why is that the measure by which we want to think about whether restorative justice is one valuable within a community or for a set of individuals, Or two, what is that the measurement standard? You know, again, there's a whole host of ways that empirically we can think about measuring outcomes of restorative justice, and random controlled trials, I said it out loud, I try to avoid it, but random controlled trials is not one of them, because I think it flies in the face of when we say voluntary, or we say, you know, mandatory, or we start to think about even just from a value-based standpoint, what this looks like. So in some ways, Lauren, right, I'm not answering your question, but I am, because I think that it's deeply dissatisfying when we try to put a dollar amount on that type of what a human life looks like, and how and where there's a whole set of other things that get ultimately impacted that simply are immeasurable.
So the framing, and thank you for answering, and of course, thank you for your time, but the question in Arlington will be, at some point, how do we fund this program? And I don't know much about restorative justice, but it seems like it would be some millions of dollars. And so that'll become a question that voters and citizens in Arlington will have to support or not support.
Sure.
So I think that that those are questions that they're going to have.
Well, you can also look at how do you braid funding, right? And this goes back to one of my answers before, in that if you're only isolating restorative justice as an intervention to a particular public system, that you're going to have only a limited set of funding. If you start to think about the school example I gave, if you think about restorative justice as mental health, as situating within whole multi-tiered systems of support, you have a whole other set of funding that's now available to you. And so the ways in which states fund mental health services, resources, and beyond are not the same ways in which they say fund things, they think about funding intervention specific to discipline. So part of this goes to Carl's constant reminder of the creativity that we need to have, but also then, you know, the ownership and ways in which this can be diffused. You can have youth-led restorative practices. You can have a teacher who teaches a credit-bearing course, which high school and middle school students take, where they become the practitioners of restorative justice. That's not going to require the state invest millions of dollars in order for that to occur. Those are practices that exist across the country. Those are practices that have been studied by academics, if that's important to you or not, right? So there's a lot of ways in which we can think about how we both invest our dollars, where those dollars come from, and how we start to think creatively about bringing those dollars together in a different way. Workforce investment, right? Equity, diversity. There's all of those ways in which we don't necessarily categorize restorative justice, because we're always putting it in this binary of harm, conflict, repair, criminal justice system, right? And Howard Zehr, in his work, right, had created that momentum, right? Like, I mean, his work centered restorative justice in a lot of ways in the criminal and legal system. And in some aspects, that's incredibly powerful and good. And in others, it's meant having to kind of peel back some of those layers and realize actually there's more efficacy to restorative justice. There's more possibilities to restorative justice than just that. So
there certainly is more discussion amongst funders to think about longer term and maximum impact around restorative justice, as opposed to very specialized short-term funding. And so that's beginning to gain momentum, which I think is important. Some of the models we've seen overseas, but again, it depends on and I don't know how to talk about Arlington because I don't know enough on that, but one of the models overseas is a center based in a university, but they've actually offered services to multiple government departments who find them helpful, whether that's the health department, the safety and security, the corrections, and so on. And each of them allotting an element of their budget towards the center, which then allows the center to have running costs. But then you also have to ask, you need to parse out what kind of control might the state have in this, and so on. So all that relationship would have to be worked out. There are a number of questions here that do have some other statistic things. I'm willing to share a screen real quick if it feels appropriate, Lauren and others.
Yeah, do. Yeah, you have the ability.
Yeah, some of the statistics that, but I think when we look at research, we have to be very careful, as has already been said, that this is not, this is not huge research covering, my apologies. Let me jump this forward a little bit. I thought I had it at the place. Here's one way of looking at it. This is from 2006. There's been a lot more research coming out, but let's be clear. This field is new in its research and theorizing. There's just been it's really now beginning to take off because it was a practice field that in its origins in the 70s when it came about. Here's some work by Umbright, Vos, and Coates, 2006. Again, you need to think about context. But I'm sorry, when we're looking at these statistics, this can help us begin to think about, and I have a range of statistics here because there's a number of different specific local research projects put together. So that's why you can see the range and it's not so clear. But participation, sometimes as high as 90%, other times 40 to 60. That's of all the parties coming together around these processes we're talking about. Participant satisfaction has always been high consistently in much of the research. Of course, that depends on the facilitation process. And when we say participant satisfaction, we mean both those who've been harmed, the harm doer, other support services, and those around. Fairness has been given a level of thumbs up in some of this work. And this is specifically about restorative justice conferencing or dialogue. So this is one restorative process that is more connected to the criminal legal system. So let's take that into consideration too. Restitution and repayment, I think this is one of those things that's particularly interesting because the court, to point, has been unable to garner more than 30 to 50% success rate in gathering the restitution that the judge or the court would order. Whereas when they have in-person gathering that the community is involved in and so on, the restitution repayment rate goes up astronomically, usually between 70 to 90%, 80, 90%. We do need to note net widening, and this is about the current system co-opting restorative justice, as they have many other reform efforts to just make this program another extension of their control and surveillance. And so this is really important. One of the things that the system has done—
Hey, Carl, I'm sorry, what is net widening?
So let me explain that. Net widening, as if you have an analogy in your mind or a picture, metaphor in your picture, the net's getting bigger. What that means is, at times, restorative justice for the institution has, the criminal legal system has said, oh, we'll use you, but for only the most minor cases. In fact, what they're saying is, we're gonna throw minor cases to you that we wouldn't even pay attention to in the current system. And so then what we do in our desperation for a few cases, we grab these crumbs and put a lot of energy, effort, and resources into it, when in fact we've widened the net. These are situations that are so minuscule, they can be handled in very different ways, and the current system wouldn't. It's sort of the waste of the current system, and therefore we've widened the net. In other words, we've criminalized nuisance crimes that could be otherwise handled in a different way. And so we need to be careful that we aren't played that way as the system. And so one of the things that the current pushback to the system now is that we're asking for total diversion. We're asking for ways in which the system will send a case without formalizing it into the system so that we can process it and potentially divert it completely without it being formalized. So that's one way to work against the net widening process. Someone asked about recidivism. What we do know generally is about here, 26 to 32% lower rates for those who participated in restorative justice processes. It's much higher in certain indigenous communities who've taken the justice process back and using their indigenous practices. One other study I know about, it was a difference between 22% recidivation for those who went through a restorative process. So it wasn't zero, this isn't a panacea, but 34% recidivated who didn't have any restorative option for them. So they compared the two. And so that's significant for research purposes. Here's one cost analysis basis that's saying it's about a third less costly. We'd have to look into how they measure that than those who go through the system, but they put some numbers to it in a case by case situation. What we do know is the current system is very expensive, and there are ways in which restorative justice, especially using a volunteer base, can get a lot more accomplished in a very efficient amount of time without the same cost.
Carl, that's excellent. I know a lot of folks here in Arlington love numbers.
And I just put definitions of net widening and net deepening in the chat for folks that are interested in both of those concepts.
Okay, so I have another question about kind of in the restorative justice model, we kind of have the community accountability as a part of it. So in those new or different models, and this also has to do with the defunding the police, do you see any potential for vigilante justice or kind of restorative justice going wrong?
You're nodding, Carl. You seem intrigued to answer this question. I wouldn't call vigilante justice restorative justice, so I think I'm having a harder time answering that question because I think I'll go down my own personal viewpoint.
I'm nodding my head because I think I understand the question, but let me say, yeah, I mean, we need to define some terms there. So I think that's the biggest thing. Vigilante, as I understand vigilante, from an international perspective, is a more sort of a communal or mob or social justice process. That's a public justice. Sorry, not a social justice. A public justice process in a collective sort of sense that can be fair sometimes. But not violent, but sometimes can be very violent and unfair, and has been termed many other things like kangaroo courts and so on. I think, yeah, I mean, anyone could take restorative justice, I suppose, and claim it, though I think restorative justice, by its very nature and language and process and skills, would have to be left behind at some point for something like the traditional vigilante violence to be enacted. In other words, restorative justice would no longer be in that equation. We have done training in places where there's a high level of public violence on the streets, so to speak, where the legal system does not intervene or is not able or is broken down enough that citizens on the ground on the streets feel like they need to handle things like theft in the market and so on like that. And the same thing can be discussed about here in cities. And I would put under the umbrella of restorative justice movements like The Interrupters, which is also a film that you can look at. I believe that was also in Chicago. Was that in the New York area? I'm trying to remember now. But The Interrupters are groups of young people trained in how to interrupt violence before it escalates to the place where there's going to be physical harm. So when arguments start in a public setting, they intervene. And if they have to physically take people in a car out of the community to keep them from harming another person till they cool down, that kind of work, I think, has restorative implications. May not be restorative justice, but it's part of the preventative mandate that restorative justice might have.
I think the challenge that I have, and it's not to be cavalier, that it's difficult to answer, is that I think there's an assumption of homogeneity to what restorative justice means, right? And again, I think we have to be really clear that whether it's thinking about from a value-based standpoint, from a practice standpoint, right, from a form standpoint, those are all different things. And so to the extent where you see a transformation, in my mind, where a set of behaviors, maybe then we're thinking more about practice, right? The ways in which the set of behaviors transform to something that's about harming and punishing, that I think you are no longer in a restorative framework. So taking matters into your own hands, right, whatever that might mean to you, I think moves into a punitive framework, moves into a harm-based framework, moves into something that doesn't actually look about how and where, if we get back to the point I made at the beginning, repairing a web of social relationships. If your ultimate goal is not to repair a web of social relationships or reinvest in a web of social relationships, then I don't think that the work that you're doing, no matter what you call it, is, quote, restorative justice. But again, that's a presumption that there is something that binds us all in this concept of restorative justice. And that too can be a disputed idea, though I think more of a theoretical concept. And, I think so often, and this is an example I think about with circles, it's very hard to describe what a circle is until you sit in it. Right. And then you sit in it and you're like, oh, well, that makes sense. Like, I get it now. And I see why and how you would use this language about restorative justice. So it's almost in some ways you see it when it's happening, it when it's happening, and then it becomes much more problematic to always be sort of stepping back and trying to just categorize, classify, sort of have things that fit really neatly into a pile. There is something beautifully messy about the practice of restorative justice, because there's something beautifully messy about the human experience and all of us. And when we all come together, whether that's two people coming together or a whole community coming together, and we try to figure out the messiness together, right, it's bound to have bumps, blips, turns, etc. And we might end up upside down, or we might end up sideways. But that's the point. And that's, this goes back to even an example about schools. If you build a social fabric, then when things go sideways, as they inevitably do in schools and in life, you have a better place from which to orient yourself from to try to deal with that sideways nature than if you never had a framework to begin with. And so when we start to operationalize restorative justice, we do so through that whole web, because you can't just deal with conflict and harm when conflict and harm happens. You have to have a baseline set of understandings with each other before you can start to address that. And I think that's true then from a community standpoint, like how and where is there an acceptance of a particular set of ownership over behaviors that should never move into the justice system? You know, so from an advocacy standpoint, as a community, what is it as a community to come together and say, yes, we want to have restorative options within our criminal legal system, but we also don't actually want to have certain things classified behaviorally as a crime. And you can have both of those, which means you can also be an abolitionist and a restorative justice-ish, a restorativist simultaneously, right? You can advance an abolition of a part of a system that is not functioning and actually doesn't serve a justice end, and simultaneously say, but in certain instances, I do think that there are these other mechanisms. Or maybe that's your long-term strategy. You recognize that abolition isn't going to happen tomorrow. So you say, okay, well, let's chip away at the system. Let's start to take away, or let's start to recognize that we see disproportionately restorative justice is offered to juveniles and not to adults, by and large, right? And that's not just at the pre-adjudication stage, that's across the entire life cycle of what a criminal matter might look like. Why are we throwing adults away? Why are we not saying that there's a value that we should place on adults and not juveniles simultaneously for a similar set of behaviors? Why do we only want to look at low-level crimes, right? So there's all of these different components that you could be sort of advancing simultaneously to start to move to. I think to one of the original questions that would ask, like, what is it to transform into a restorative community? It's all of those operating at the same time.
I think fundamental to our conversation, we need, going back full circle in some ways about how do we even have this discussion, we have to agree that justice is not only evident in a set of legal codes that are stagnant and written and have mandatory or minimum, attachments to the punishment of them. We need to take justice and recenter it in and embed it in relationships and community, familial networks, where people are coming together and working together. And once we start that, then justice takes on a much broader than just a legalistic understanding. And that's one of the biggest things, is working with language right now. And then restorative justice not only borrows from legal theory, but it borrows from, social theory and psychological theory and theology and the neuroscience and trauma theory. There's many different, empathy theory, so it's a diverse theory base that comes together to try to work with justice at a human level, a relational level. After all, most of our harm is relational. We have such a thing in the criminal justice or the criminal legal system that says there's victimless crime, but in fact, are there? How are harms that I may be engaged in that aren't directly connected to one person on a primary basis affecting the community or my neighbors or the extended family around me?
We have a few more questions, but I wanted to let everyone know that in the chat, there's a link to our YouTube channel that we would invite you to click it and subscribe, so that when our videos such as this one come out, you're notified. Kateri, do you have another question from the audience? I see there may be a couple more.
Oh,
yeah,
sure. We
follow
can
us
ask
on
this.
Instagram.
Yeah.
And Twitter and
Facebook. So what role, if any, do you see the police serving in a restorative justice system? What are your views on defunding the police versus abolishing the police? And how does that connect to a restorative justice framework?
So, I would say there's a couple questions in there. So I'll start with the bigger question, which is, I'm just looking at it so I get it right. Do you see the police serving a restorative justice system? It depends on what system you want to have, right? So family group conferencing, actually, and Wagga Wagga and other forms of what's characterized as restorative justice that exists as in international models outside of the US, actually have the police serving, and state actors, right? So like family group conferencing, have them serve a direct function in what that looks like. where they are participatory throughout what that whole processing of and movement of a young person in particular through, quote, the justice system is. We don't have something that looks like that. We do have, for example, in the state of Colorado, that officers are empowered legislatively to be able to make a decision in the field about whether a young person should be diverted to a restorative justice program, or be ticketed, right, and be arrested. So we have existing models where police actually situate themselves within a larger restorative justice system that still lives within or is nested in within our criminal legal system. Now, you can argue that that's good and bad, and I'll give you responses to both of those. You know, it's negative in the sense that you're now asking officers in the field with all of the personal experiences, being a law enforcement officer, and potential implicit and explicit bias to make an ad hoc decision that's deeply discretionary about a set of behaviors in that moment. There's not necessarily the full amount of reflection, and there certainly aren't the protections that exist if you were to move through more traditional, like being arrested and then move through the process, the criminal justice system, where you'd be protected, right, in terms of what that looks like. So on the one hand, right, discretionary decision-making and how that might then lead to disparate outcomes could be exacerbated by having officers have that type of power. Now, I work with folks in Colorado. I know jurisdictions where that exists, and folks would argue against that deeply and actually say, no, it's really important because we aren't going to widen the net. We aren't going to ticket. We aren't, we're keeping young people out of the system before they ever would have come into it. And then I think the counter to that is, well, don't criminalize that behavior, and you never even give folks that opportunity. So you could be moving, so you could see how then on either side of the coin, right, officers, and if we talk at the federal, officers and agents both, right, could serve within a larger restorative system within the criminal legal system. Now to your question about, well, actually I'll pause. Carl, do you want to respond to that question, and then we can both pivot to the defunding police?
Sure, I would agree with you on that. I think on what you've answered so far, my experience locally working with police, though, is that we need to put the police not acting on their own, but within a coalition or a group. So we have the universities, the schools, K through 12, a local mediation center, and in a coalition around the police in their efforts. And it's a program based like Colorado, even though they don't have the legislative backing, they're actually running it in our town, which is a small town, with the discretion to divert before they even ticket or enter into the legal system in a formal way. We're not getting the cases we would like, and that's another issue on its own that needs to be discussed. And we have to begin to talk about training and education and how to make this understood as not just another add-on to their services as police, but as ways of the police engaging in the community and building a community relationship, and that looks very different than what we often see now. The second part of that question is much bigger, and I have stronger feelings for sure on that.
Yeah, and I think I would just add, what that made me think, what Carl is saying is, again, this presumes that you want to continue the status quo, right? So the presumption still underlines that we have, and this goes to the second question, that we want to have the current system, but we somehow just want to have a modification of the current system that has the attachment of the word restorative, or perhaps truly is restorative. And the question you have to ask is whether or not you want to maintain the status quo, whether or not you want to maintain the current structure and you're just making minor modifications, or if you simply want to reimagine what that entire system looks like. Because police, and it's a very broad term, right? The individuals that work for police departments don't all look the same, and their roles don't all function in the same way. So let's be really clear about that too. But, and that's not about advocating for or against the police. It's just to be clear that I want us to understand that there's a whole range of individuals that serve different functions in a police capacity. But do we want to keep with what our current system is, and if so, is there a role then for policing in the way that it looks right now? I would argue that if we don't have our current, if we don't have the American legal system and we don't have the American criminal legal system, the role for police looks radically different. So part of it is to say, starting with the police, it might be a great place, might not be a great place, but we have to look again at the totality of what the system looks like. And I don't think it's sufficient to just suggest that police serving or not serving, and this is not a critique of the question, I think it's an excellent set of questions that we have to grapple with, but it's police are one actor or one set of actors within a larger structure, right? And it's a larger structure that, to be really clear, is embedded in structural racism and is embedded in anti-Blackness and is embedded in a legacy of slavery, right? I mean, we have these laws to ultimately carry through what was an existence of slavery, and how law has replicated that subordination and how law has privileged whiteness is not just sort of a new thing that people made up yesterday or made up this summer, right? I mean, this has been a long documented place and space for what that exists in. So I think that's a central place of what we need to ask ourselves is, how do we dismantle that as a larger system? And then these discrete roles of all of these actors and all of these laws have to then be interrogated. But Carl, you have strong views on question 2. I never get to hear.
No, I'm with you. I'm with you on that. I said strong views. You said a lot of it already about, I think we need to acknowledge the uniqueness of our police system. Not that this hasn't happened in other places of policing like apartheid in South Africa, but that our policing system has this long history, and it can be traced and well documented if you look at the new Jim Crow and Michelle Alexander's work and many others. This is well documented. And so that's one of the burning issues that we have to think about is how do we begin to dismantle that? And I would simply say, what I feel strongly about is that there are a lot of ways to defund the police that may not mean abolishing. We need to differentiate between those two concepts. In other words, I think there's a great deal of resources being wasted on our police, and especially as it militarizes the policing system and continues to do that in such a way so that militarization reinforces the racism and the violence of the system. And there are many ways in which that money and those resources could be redirected and should be redirected into social services and other alternatives to build the community up in its justice efforts. And so I think we have a great amount of work to do just to begin to think about redistribution of the resources for the militarization of the police. That should be one of our first demands as we begin to try to think about dismantling any structure.
I want to just be mindful of the time, because we said we would end at 7:30. So
Sure. Sorry.
I want to thank, this is a great conversation. I can't tell you how I appreciate it, Carl and Thalia. You guys did a great job. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you for everyone that was here. We really appreciate it.